Good evening, everyone. I wonder, Judith or Cheryl, are you gonna, or Jessica, any
Yes, we are.
introductions? I wonder.
Shall I go, Jessica? All right. Welcome. I'm Judith Elaine, a Zen practitioner at the Ecumenical Buddhist Society in Little Rock, helping us with the technical aspects of our weekend is Jessica from Appamada Zen Center in Austin. Jessica, would you like to give us some instruction?
Yes, thanks, Judith. I just have a really quick thing to say. This shouldn't take long, and I'll share my screen with you so that you can have a visual. I'm just going to be in the background helping out, but I'm the person to chat. If you have any questions, you can do that through your chat feature, and I'll show you what that means here. So on the bottom of your screen, usually if you're on a computer, it's a little different if you're on an iPad or phone, but you're probably familiar by now with the Zoom meeting controls. I just wanted to point out that the chat feature is where you can talk to me, and the reactions is where you'll raise your hand. So if there is an inquiry period where Flint is welcoming people to speak one by one, you'll raise your hand. So you press this little reaction button and then raise hand, and then I'll see your little hand raised in the corner, and then let you know to go into queue. And then there's the little chat window. And you can type to everyone, or you should also have a little caret there where you can send it directly to me. And it's my name is Jessica, and you should see moderator by my name. And that's about it from me. Thank you. Back to you now, Judith.
All right. I'm Judith Elaine from the Ecumenical Buddhist Society in Little Rock, and it is our extreme good fortune to have renowned Zen teacher Flint Sparks with us this weekend. Flint will share with us love and wisdom. Before Flint was dedicated his life to teaching Zen Buddhism, he was a practicing psychologist for almost 30 years. Flint is currently a senior teacher with Appamada, a center for Zen practice and inquiry in Austin, Texas. He is also a guiding teacher for the Open Door Zen community in Madison, Wisconsin. And just this, a consortium of Zen practice groups in the UK. Here's Flint.
Thanks, Judith. Judith is our renowned Zen practitioner in Little Rock. I always love that. One of the most beautiful things at the moment is, of course, looking at all of your faces and seeing the names of all of these people, many of whom I know, some I don't, but it's a wonderful collection of people with whom I've had the privilege of sitting and teaching and working with for so many years in so many different places. And then there's all these new people. So it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for once again turning on your computer and sitting in front of a screen. I know it's no small thing, given the way that we're spending our time these days. So I want to provide just maybe a little bit of orientation to what I plan, and hopefully this fits what you might have planned for the day. When I was speaking with Cheryl, at least on my screen, she's right next to Judith, who has been a very steady and deeply practiced leader there in Little Rock. We were reflecting on my previous visit to Little Rock, and then last year, my attempted visit to Little Rock, which was very curious because the retreat that we had scheduled came precisely as the pandemic happened, as many of you know. So I did a talk similar to this, and we were fortunate to have quite a number of people come. And the focus of that retreat, or the talk at least, was beginner's mind, that well-known and sort of inclusive phrase that Shunryu Suzuki Roshi from the San Francisco Zen Center used often, and which is part of his book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And as we began to talk about, once again, a possibility of having a retreat, in this case, online again, that one was like the first we'd done, because everything was just happening. It was very, very new. And now we're kind of old hands at these things. But there was a suggestion by Judith and Cheryl both that there might be, at least in Arkansas, and I'm going to speak as if I'm speaking primarily to the Sangha there in Little Rock, even though I know there are many of you other places, that the ecumenical center there, by its very name, calls a number of Buddhist teachers from various traditions, the Theravadan Vipassana type teachings, and many of the various Tibetan teachers and lineages. But it's been a while since you've had a steady Zen teacher. And with great persistence, Judith got me to begin making a connection, and I'm so glad I did. It's been lovely. But the thought was there might be many beginners, not necessarily to Buddhist practice, but to a Zen way of practicing. And so no doubt there are many of you with quite a wide range of experience. And I know some of you have sat with me before in other places, but my intention is to offer an overview in some ways of this way, as well as, of course, to offer you teachings that will be reflected in the topic or the title, or what was put out there that you responded to, not knowing. When I did my first retreat in Little Rock, I provided an overview of just the way that I teach. This is what Judith really wanted me to do, which is rooted deeply in the Buddha's foundational teachings, of course, inspired by Zen practice, that form, but also deeply informed by psychology, and by the psychology of transformation and change. And Judith had alluded to the many years that I spent as a psychotherapist. And so I offered a practice path based on what I call the double helix of maturity, of growing up and waking up. Now, since I did that retreat and the little talk last year, we've all been pretty well shaken. And there's so much that's happened in the last few years that have been so shocking and confusing and even terrifying. So, in some ways, why would not knowing be something that sounds like a good idea? But that's our question. Why would such a thing look like a direction we'd want to follow instead of one more horrifying thing to be confronted with? So we're going to open up the question. And I would suggest that by opening this question, it's like opening a treasure chest, and we're going to discover, I think we can discover an abundant treasure there rather than an empty chest in this not knowing. this chest that's labeled not knowing. And we're going to start by reviewing this story that I sent out in some of the marketing materials that was on the website. It may have gotten your attention. It may have encouraged you to register, or you may not have read it or don't care. Some of you may have just thought, oh, we'll do this thing, and it's Flint or whatever it is. But that's the story we're going to begin with. And this is going to be a story night. I'm going to tell you several stories. Hopefully not bedtime stories, stories that will keep you more awake than asleep, because that's a lot of how the Zen tradition has been carried forward. And so we're going to follow these stories, unpacking this idea of not knowing and how central it is, and how revelatory it is, and how beautiful it is. So the story that I just published very briefly on the website and in some of the marketing materials was a story from 9th century China. And it's a Zen ancestor story. It's like in the Zen family, we collected stories just like we all have. I know every family has their stories that they keep. And some stories I know I've shared, and some I have made with many of you. In fact, I even see my cousin here, Paul, who's so wonderful. We've spent so many times together in retreats and trainings. And, you know, we have literal family stories. But this story I want to start with is one of the great teaching stories in Zen. And it's a story that my teacher would often use in her teachings. And it's an exchange between a monk, in this case, Feiyan, and his teacher, Dijang. And the setting, the way the story starts, is Feiyan, the student, is getting ready to leave the monastery and travel on foot to some other temples to further his study and his practice. And this was a common kind of thing to do. And as the monk put on his sandals and gathers his belongings to depart and get his backpack and his staff and everything, the teacher, Dijang, comes up to him and asks what seems like a very straightforward question, but this is a Zen master, you know. So he says, "Where are you going?" And the young man says, well, I'm going around a pilgrimage. And like I said, this would have been a very expected thing. In the 9th century China, the monks sometimes would spend a time in a particular training monastery, and then they would, on foot, they would walk to the other areas in the region, and in the mountains, to the other temples and other monasteries, to meet other teachers and deepen their practice, and find maybe inspiring masters with whom they would study. But in this case, so Feiyan is getting ready to do this, and Dijang says, well, where are you going? He knows what he's doing, of course, and so Feiyan says, well, I'm going to go around on a pilgrimage. And because he's a Zen master, the old man doesn't want to miss the chance to send the young student off without one final teaching. So he turns the conversation and he says, oh, what's the purpose of pilgrimage? And kind of stunned at this little turn, or a big turn maybe, and this kind of penetrating question, the young monk kind of says in his stunned set, I don't know, like we might, any of us might say. And the old man finishes the conversation with a statement that my teacher would often use. He simply said, not knowing is most intimate. Not knowing is most intimate. Another translation that Blanche Zen Roshi would often use with me, she would say, not knowing is nearest, as if it's physical. Not knowing is most intimate, not knowing is nearest. I don't know about you, but I think most of us look for answers that we can count on. We look for some ground that we can stand on. And the problem is that as we scramble for certainty and knowledge, we frequently and unwittingly really squander wisdom. And spiritual practice challenges this conventional approach to seeking, just as Dijang here kind of trips up Fan. And you can tell, his question isn't just about what he's about to do, which is an enactment of spiritual practice, certainly, this kind of walk we do through our life. And it's not just about spiritual practice. He's saying, well, what's the meaning of your life? What's the meaning of all of this? Because he wanted Fan to realize that, life is nothing but a pilgrimage. So what's its purpose? Behind it, those big questions, why are we born? Why do we die? Why is life so difficult? Why are we always longing for something else? And what do we really make of this kind of mysterious and fleeting experience? And through this exchange, it's said that Fan suddenly recognizes, as one often does if we engage in these kinds of practices in a wholesome manner, that what he needed all along was intimate. It was near him. It was right in front of him. Only he didn't realize it. He didn't know it. The way is right under your feet, right below you, in every blade of grass. So what does this kind of teaching, it was kind of a beautiful story in a certain way, but what does this kind of teaching have to do with us, and how are we going to make sense of it in our lives? It's not that transformative just to hear old stories or to study history, but if we use the stories to wake us up to something, then it's useful. Then our lives benefit and we're nourished by it. And this is always our practice challenge, no matter what your practice, no matter who your teacher is and what tradition. It's the larger koan that we'll have for this whole retreat. What are we doing? And why is it important? And the direction being suggested here is one that points directly towards intimacy, but going beyond ordinary knowing, not just ordinary knowing. And this is the direction that a pilgrimage or our Zen practice would lead us. And this is where we're going to begin our brief shared pilgrimage tonight, or whatever your time zone is. It's a little after 3 o'clock in the afternoon for me, out here in the middle of the Pacific. I have to say that, this week, I just want to acknowledge, has been quite a perilous journey for those of you in the south of the United States, in Little Rock, certainly for Austin, and in Central Texas. You faced unusual and unprecedented challenges, primarily associated with weather and all the ripples from that extreme weather. And moment to moment, I was speaking to my 90-year-old mother and my 64-year-old sister in near Austin, and my sister taking care of my mom. And we're saying, do you have power now? Have you lost water? Is it warm enough? Do you have food? So one moment you think the power's back on. And then, but then it goes away again. The next minute it changes. The storm looks like it's passing. And then no, it's going to be days. But this is the way life is. I don't mean always this big of a challenge, but we think there's some solid ground to stand on. And these days, when we try to find a place we can stand and put our weight down, we slip on ice. It's very strange. Let's make this really, really personal. Suppose someone came to you, maybe this afternoon or after tonight, and they say, now, how are you going to go spend your evening and your Saturday? You know, this is Feon putting on his stuff. And Dijong says, now, what are you doing? And maybe you say something like, well, I'm going to participate in an online retreat, and I'm going to listen to a talk by this guy. And if they pushed you further and they said, well, why are you participating in the weekend retreat online again? You know, you might say, oh, I don't know. It seemed like a good idea, you know. And what if your friend actually replied, oh, not knowing is the most intimate way to enter an event like this? Then you would know that they loved you and that they would want the best for you. If they told you what you should or shouldn't do or made some other comment, you'd know they missed the mark, and you would have too. This is intimacy. This is what's nearest. You know, just this. So if we reflect on the story, whether it's your story or the old story, there are two important messages in Dijong's teaching. Not knowing is most intimate. Not knowing are key, and intimacy. Okay. Just these two are enough. So his statement is profound and the teaching is really deep, but it's offered in this really, really compact form, which is kind of typical of the Zen women and the men who carried this practice along for 1,000 years. It's often very dense like that. But these are the two interwoven themes we're going to follow this evening and into our day of practice tomorrow. Not knowing and intimacy. Not knowing and what's nearest. So let's go back to really the early parts of Zen and the early days. You know, just in terms of history, some of you are quite aware of this, but some might not be, that the Buddhism that developed after Shakyamuni Buddha, they began to spread through northern India and other places. And one of the things that it did was in through Nepal and Tibet, it moved into the Himalayas through northern India. And in some of those places met other shamanistic and ancient ways and mixed together to become what we now call Tibetan Buddhism in its various forms, and incubated for 1,000 years there in this fantastically beautiful way. But it also spilled over the Himalayas into China. And there met certainly Confucianism as a social form in some ways, but also Taoism. And it's that marriage of Taoism and Buddhism that became Chan, C-H-A-N, Chan, which we later called Zen in Japan. But really the roots are in China, in Chan practice. And in the very beginning, when asked, you know, what is Chan? The classic response was, it's a special transmission outside the scriptures, not depending on words and letters, directly pointing to the mind, seeing into one's true nature and attaining Buddhahood. A special transmission outside the scriptures, something that's transmitted. That's why these stories are really useful. We say in the transmission from student to teacher who become, we say it's warm hand to warm hand. It's that nearness, it's that intimacy. Not depending on words and letters. It's not depending on kind of a curriculum of study, but it's directly pointing to the mind. And that's what some of these stories do. They kind of catch us and point to something. And what do we see? Our true nature. A special transmission outside the scriptures, not depending on words and letters, directly pointing to the mind, seeing into one's true nature, and actualizing, I would use that word, Buddhahood. But then we have all these stories, the koans would look like a whole bunch of words and letters, and all these teachings, these ancestor stories, our family stories. And they were old interactions, carefully preserved and collected, that could be used in teaching. And there are several famous people in history, we don't have to go into all of it now, who collected these things and wrote them up and made comments on them. And these are some of the ones we'll be following along tonight. The word koan, if you broke it down in the original symbols in Chinese, means a public case. Almost like a lawyer would draw up a form that would lay out, it's the record of a meeting. That's all it is. It's a public record of a meeting. Now, somehow, because of the way that they've been received in the West, people think of a koan, automatically think, okay, this is like a paradoxical thing which you can't answer, and it's going to be used to trip you up, and some enigmatic tale is going to push you into a rare and special state of awareness, and then, you're enlightened. That's the romantic tale of Zen. But the actual stories, like the one I just talked about, are real interactions, and they're earthy and personal. Now, the language may seem odd because this is so many centuries old, and the form of them, many of them, is quite predictable. It's kind of like when you go on Netflix now because you don't have anything else to do. And you say, okay, it's the same predictable kind of stories, but just a different story. Well, the form is somewhat predictable, just not the way the story goes, though, in a koan. And the predictable nature usually is a student comes to the teacher, asks a question about awakening or enlightenment, and they gets a response that seems surprising or shocking or confusing at first glance, or maybe even oddly untethered from the original question. The thing about it is, the teacher always wants more from the student than even the student knows. And the teacher is giving them their all. It's like, as I said, if you were engaged in that kind of interaction about coming to the retreat and your friend said, oh yeah, not knowing is the most intimate way to start a weekend like this, that's how you know that they loved you and that they were offering you their whole heart. These are what the teachers are doing. So here's an early one about Bodhidharma, who was the archetypal, maybe historical, maybe not, monk who brought the Buddhist teachings from India into China. And this is the first koan in one of the big collections from the 12th century called the Blue Cliff Record. The stories are not from the 12th century, but a monk collected them in the 12th century and wrote poems and commentaries. And so the Blue Cliff Record is one of the famous ones. And this is number one. Here's the story. So Emperor Wu of Liang, who was emperor at that time in this area of China, asked the great master Bodhidharma. So Bodhidharma had come to China. He shows up in the court of the emperor. And the emperor apparently Emperor Wu was really interested in spiritual matters. And he'd built a number of temples and monasteries. And in those days, it was thought that if you did that you gained a lot of merit. Pretty much like what we think these days when people make contributions to things, it's going to be a good thing. So Emperor Wu asked for an audience with Bodhidharma. He comes in and the emperor says, what is the highest meaning of the holy truths? In other words, give me your best shot here. Tell me what the deepest meaning is of things. What is the highest meaning of the holy truths? And Bodhidharma says, vast emptiness, nothing holy. So being a little unsettled by that, the emperor says, who are you? Like, who is facing me? And Bodhidharma replied, I don't know. And the emperor didn't understand. And after this, Bodhidharma turned and left, crossed the Yangtze River, and kept going. And then the emperor called his spiritual advisor in the court in and said, and the advisor said to the emperor, does your majesty know who this man is? It's kind of like those of us that grew up at a certain time. It's like, who was that masked man? Do you realize who that was? And the emperor said, no, I don't know. And the spiritual advisor said, that's the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. That's the Bodhisattva of compassion, transmitting the ultimate teachings to you. And the emperor felt very regretful, like he'd missed out. And so he wanted to send an emissary to go get Bodhidharma and bring him back and like have another shot at it. And his court spiritual advisor said, Your Majesty, don't send anybody to try to get him to come back. Even if everyone in the whole country went after him, he wouldn't return. So let's look back at this little story a little bit. We have two don't knows, not knowing. The emperor says, tell me what the deepest teachings are. Bodhidharma tells him what they are. Vast emptiness, nothing holy. He points to shunyata, to dependent origination, to the primary teachings of the Buddha. That if you want to understand where the teachings are leading you, it's into the fullness of interdependence beyond the individually existing self. It doesn't have to be holy. It's ordinary and beautiful. He's opening the treasure box and showing him vast emptiness, nothing holy. And because this is such an unusual response, because the emperor expects to get something, an answer, then he says, basically, who are you to answer me like that? And that's when Bodhidharma says, I don't know. He doesn't claim a self, which would begin to reorient this conversation back into the ordinary. And then he turns and leaves. And then when the court advisor asks the emperor, like, do you know who that was? The emperor says, I don't know. There's another, I don't know. And he says, well, that was basically a great teacher, a great bodhisattva, the great teacher of compassion. And he said, well, go get him, bring him back. And he says, no, you can't do that. It won't happen. It's not that a man couldn't be returned to the court. He's saying, even if you brought him back, you couldn't nail him down like you want. He left you with the highest teachings, vast emptiness, nothing holy. He led you in a few interactions to, I don't know. And you missed what it was about. And even if you bring him back, you can't nail him down. He still won't return. So you could finally get your answer. That was your answer. That was the treasure chest. And so the entire Blue Cliff record starts with this opening the treasure chest, a vast emptiness, nothing holy. But remember, emptiness, shunyata, dependent origination, whatever you want to call it, means everything exists only in relationship to everything else. Nothing is independent. When we say it's empty, we don't mean there is nothing there. In fact, we say that in the Heart Sutra, the form is emptiness, not empty. What it's empty of is individuality. everything is empty of its own individual self. What it's full of is the interaction of the entire universe, which creates it. So it's actually fullness. The treasure chest is full and overflowing, not empty. That's the vast emptiness. And it's also not holy. It's not higher. It's close. It's near. It's intimate. And this is what the emperor was unable to receive at that time. So let's go further. Story number 3. I keep walking through the stories here. When I was sewing my robes, this is a small one, the rakusu, which is the smaller version of the okesa, the one that wraps around. I spent a lot of time with my teacher because she was the person who transmitted this way of sewing, and she told me this story, which I found very touching. And this one is further on down the line. Bodhidharma supposedly brought Chan from the Buddha into China, and then he had a student, Eka, who took on the teachings, and on. And there's a lineage of teachers, which of course historically is not exactly accurate, but it's a way of understanding this flow of hand to hand to warm hand, warm heart to warm heart transmission. And so this one, the so-called 42nd ancestor, Ryozan Inkan, these are the Japanese names, was the attendant to the 41st. So Ryozan is going to become the next main ancestor. And his teacher, Duan Kanshi, was who he was the attendant for. And because he was his attendant, he would carry his master's or teacher's robes. And so they went to the Buddha hall one day, and they were going to do service. And the teacher needed his robe, so Ryozan brought the robe to him. And the teacher said to him, as he began putting on the robe, it's quite a complex thing if you've never seen it happen and if you've never done it. I remember asking one of my friends one time when I was learning, I says, what do you think it means to be a priest? We were newly ordained, and he was an older guy, and he said, I think it's fabric management primarily. It's very complex how you do these things. But in this case, the teacher turned to his disciple who had handed him the robe, and he began to put it on, and said to the disciple, what's the business under this patched robe? What is it that's under this patched robe? It's kind of an odd question, what is this form? Why put on this thing? It's what are you? It's actually like the emperor asking Bodhidharma, who are you? What is this? And in this case, I know I would have probably responded the same way. In this case, the student didn't have an answer. He just kind of looked at him. And in that gap of the not knowing, the teacher said, to wear this robe and to not understand the great matter is the greatest suffering. To wear this robe and to not understand the great matter is the greatest suffering. And so he says, why don't you ask me? He's helping him. He's giving him a hand here. So the student says to the teacher, what is this business under your patched robe? And the teacher says, intimacy. Intimacy. And it's said in the old stories that this was the moment that the student Ryozan began to go a little beyond the regular barriers of his constrained consciousness. It began to open up, kind of broke through a little bit. He bowed to his teacher in gratitude. He was really touched. It was beyond just psychological. He was really touched deeply, and he kind of broke open and he began to weep a bit and bowed to his teacher. And seeing this, the teacher continues and he said, well, what have you understood? When I said that, can you express it to me? And all the student could do is repeat the question and the answer. He said, what is the matter under this robe? Intimacy. And his teacher said to him, intimacy and even greater intimacy. Yes, intimacy, but more than you know. Nearer than your own skin. What is this intimacy? What is the business under your patched robe? What's the business under your sweater, your jacket? What is this business sitting in front of the computer screen? What's the meaning and purpose of sitting in meditation, chanting unusual verses we'll do tomorrow, studying these ancient stories? What's the meaning of the anxiety of asking a question, raising your hand, wanting to look into your own heart and mind more than anything in the world and afraid to do it? Who are you and who am I? And how can we come to be intimate with this rather than simply trying to know this? So intimacy and knowing or not knowing start to weave together. It's about becoming intimate rather than knowing more. So Bodhidharma, who brought the teachings to China, talked about as a special transmission outside the scriptures, beyond what you could write down and teach. And when he met the emperor, he said it was vast emptiness, nothing holy. He didn't know who he was. The emperor didn't understand. And then in these other stories that I've told, not knowing is most intimate, intimacy, even greater intimacy. There's something about the way these two things are weaving together that offer us a way to practice, because it's opening things. It's opening the treasure chest. But let's look at another story. And this time, maybe it will help us touch this not knowing in a little different way. And this is from another collection called The Gateless Gate. It's case 19. And the title usually given to this case is Ordinary Mind is the Way. So this is another way to penetrate, to be intimate with not knowing. And this one, remember how things go. There's a teacher and a student. Joshu is the student asking his teacher Nansen. And by the way, Joshu became one of the luminaries of the golden age of Zen in China. So he became like one of the greats. And in this case, he's the student. He's younger and he's talking to his teacher, Nansen. And he comes to him and he asks the question that in some way every student is asking in these situations. He says to his teacher, what is the way? You know, how do we practice? What it's like the emperor saying, what's the highest teachings of the truth? And Nansen says, the ordinary mind is the way. But that's not what he expected to hear. Ordinary mind? So Joshu hangs in there with his teacher, like he should. He says, well, should I direct myself toward it or not? It's like coming to a retreat. And Nansen says, if you try to turn toward it, you're going to go against it. Oh boy, here's the Zen guy, If you try to turn toward it, you're going to go against it. But Joshu is good. He says, now wait a minute, if I don't turn toward it, then how can I know it's the way? Then Nansen comes through for him. He says, what is the way? Ordinary mind is the way. Should I direct myself toward it? Like, how can I practice? And he says, if you try to turn toward it, you're going to go against it. Well, if I don't turn toward it, how am I going to know it's the way? And Nansen says, the way does not belong to knowing or not knowing. It's like, it's the wrong question. Knowing is delusion. Not knowing, traditionally not knowing, is a blank consciousness. The way does not belong to knowing or not knowing. Knowing is delusion. Not knowing is a blank consciousness. When you have really reached the true way beyond all doubt, you will find it as vast and boundless as the great empty firmament. And like what Bodhidharma said, how can it be talked about on the level of right and wrong? And as often in these old stories, it says then Joshu was enlightened, something happened with his teacher answering like that. So the path of enlightenment of all beings, the way, is just ordinary mind, but it can't be just ordinary as in conventional or everyday like we think of it. Of course, it is ordinary mind, but with a difference, with a twist. This is ordinary without any boundary or horizon, on the other side of which lies something more or better or mystically complete. It's ordinary, which is so full and so unbound that it contains everything. There's not an edge. It says, now this is ordinary and that's extraordinary, and that's where we're going to go, because that's what spiritual practice gives us. The way does not belong to knowing or not knowing. Knowing is delusion. Not knowing is just a blank, like stupidity. Like when you've really reached the true way beyond doubt, you'll find it as vast and boundless as the great empty firmament. How could it be talked about on the level of right and wrong? Now, I told you that these stories often have commentary, and I'm going to give you an example of that. In this story, Muman, who is the person who collected the stories in the Gateless Gate, is sometimes called the Mumakan after him. Here was his commentary. And it sounds like a koan too, but it opens the treasure chest a little more. It says, Nansen, that was the teacher, was asked a question by Joshu, and Nansen's base was shattered and melted away. He could not justify himself. Even though Joshu had come to realization, he would have to delve into it for another 30 years before he can realize it fully. Now, this is the kind of thing that gives Zen a bad name, when people say, what are they talking about? So Nansen was asked a question by Joshu. You get that part, right? And Nansen's base was shattered and melted away. He couldn't justify himself. Nansen, who was the greater teacher, Joshu came to ask him a question. Nansen had to leave the larger, wakeful consciousness. It was shattered, and he came onto the ground in front of his student. And that's where they met, near, intimate. He couldn't hang out in some Zen master place. He came close. And when he did, Joshu had a realization. And it said, and he will have to delve into it for another 30 years before he can fully realize it. These things take time to ripen. Just because you have an insight doesn't mean you're awake. It means you've seen a glimmer. It's like last night, I woke and there was these weird flashes. And this is not so common here, but as I looked over the ocean from the hilltop where we are, we could see the island of Oahu in the distance. There was a thunderstorm. And when the lightning would flash, you could see 60 miles across the ocean. And then it would go dark again. And those moments of realization are like that. But it might take me a long time to figure out how to get over there, to fully understand the territory. The verse that Muman wrote in response to this, he said, the spring flowers, the moon in autumn, the cool breezes of summer, the winter snow, if idle concerns do not cloud the mind, this is a person's happiest season. No matter what the season, no matter what you're doing, if idle concerns don't cloud the mind, then your heart can come forward. And Mumon's Dharma talk about this, read his words. He said, ordinary mind, what is it? It's nothing but our everyday consciousness, our everyday life. Not just what you think, it's our everyday life. It's getting up, washing your face, eating breakfast, going to work, walking, running, laughing, crying, turning on the computer, turning it off, the leaves on the trees, the flowers in the field, the snow coming down on the icicles, flowers, white, red, purple, it's birth, it's death. That is the way. He said, you don't even have to use the word mind, ordinary mind. The ordinary is the way, close. The supreme way is an absolute fact that transcends knowing and intellectualization. The absolute fact cannot be calculated, cannot be measured relatively, nor can it be gained after birth. You can't create it. Not knowing in the regular way means total ignorance and stupidity, which of course has nothing to do with Zen and enlightenment. Therefore, this is beyond knowing, rather than our usual way of thinking of not knowing. And it's here, it's ordinary, it's your life. It's not some special fancy mind state. And I mentioned that as Bodhidharma came to China, he met Confucianism as one of the strong foundations for the Chinese culture and society. And there's a famous Confucian saying that says, the way is at hand. Remember, that's our question here. The way is at hand, but people are looking for it afar. Farmers use it every day without being aware of it. We cannot be separated from the way, even for an instant. What we can be separated from is not the way. Wow. I'll read it backwards. What you can be separated from, if there's something that becomes an object of your consciousness that you think is something you can strive for, that's not the way. You remember Nansen saying, if you turn toward it, you go against it? What you can be separated from, what you can separate yourself from, what you can make dualistic isn't the way. We cannot be separated from the way even for an instant. We're embedded. We're like a fish in the ocean. In fact, people like farmers are using it every day without even being aware of it. It's life. It's doing what we need to do to live. People look for it like it's a long way away, and it's in your hand. It's right here. It's close. Intimacy, and even greater intimacy. Not knowing is beyond knowing. Beyond knowing is nearest. Stepping beyond knowing and settling into your life. Not knowing, intimacy, ordinary, beyond knowing, the way. Let's go back even further. More stories. The sixth ancestor, Wening, this is like 7th century. There's a very famous story. Some of you have heard before. The story goes like this. The 5th ancestor was getting old and realizing that he needed to find a successor, someone with whom he could offer Dharma transmission and ask them to carry literally the robes and the bowl and just carry on the tradition as the lineage holder for the school. And so he decided one of the ways that would help him in his selection process was he would have a little competition. It's kind of like the 7th century version of one of those game shows or reality TV, you know. He'd ask all the monks to write a poem, and that would demonstrate their understanding, and they would publish them. They put them on the wall. Everybody could see the poems, and he could make some decision. Now, part of the backstory is that Huining was an illiterate person from a lower class who would sell firewood. And in the town where he was from, he had walked by a home and he had heard a woman chanting from the Diamond Sutra, an ancient and venerable Buddhist sutra. And it just shattered him. It's like somehow he knew it to be true, and that truth opened him to something that he couldn't explain. He wasn't sure what to do with. So he sought out a monastery. And so he just ends up in the monastery there with the fifth ancestor. And because he was illiterate, and because he was not ordained, and because he was a lower class, he didn't have entree to the training in the traditional way. But the abbot could tell there was something about him. So he said, would you stay in the barn and help grind the rice and help support the monks, and you'll be here part of the community, but not in the zendo, you'll be in the barn. Remember farmers? So when it came time for the competition, poems were written, they were posted. And one evening, Huining, the illiterate fellow, went in, and of course he couldn't read them. And so he asked one of the other monks, he said, would you read the poems to me? And everyone figured that this most senior monk, they kind of knew who was going to win because he was the senior guy. And so Huining said, well, read his poem to me. And this is one translation of the poem, which is 4 lines long. The body is the tree of wisdom, the mind but a bright mirror. At all times diligently polish it to remain untainted by dust. So it's a beautiful poem. It kind of echoes a little bit about if idle concerns do not cloud the mind. It's intimate. The body is the tree of wisdom. The mind is a mirror, primary awareness, reflecting everything. At all times, diligently polish it, practice to remain untainted by dust. It's a beautiful poem. And so Huining says to his buddy who was helping him, he said, okay, I have a poem. Would you write it down and post it for me? And then I'm getting out of here because I'm not supposed to be doing this. And his friend said, okay. So here's the poem that Huining dictated. The tree of wisdom fundamentally does not exist, nor is there a stand for the mirror. Originally, there's not a single thing, so where could dust alight? This is the poem that points to vast emptiness, nothing holy. The tree of wisdom fundamentally does not exist, nor is there a stand for the mirror. Originally, there's not a single thing, so where would dust alight? And it's said that when the fifth ancestor saw the poem, he understood that Huining had the greater understanding. And he called him in secretly at night, gave him the bowl and the robe, and basically said, make a run for it, because the other monks are not going to be happy about this, that I'm giving this to an illiterate farm worker, but you do have the highest understanding. And most of our lineages and contemporaries Zen come from the lineage from Huining at that point. But here is a beautiful, and once again, a turning little teaching from the contemporary Zen teacher, Joko Beck. Some of you are familiar with her teachings. She was a student of Maizumi Roshi, one of the first generation Japanese teachers here in the United States. She practiced in San Diego and died at 92 or 3, I can't remember. A while back, she was Peg's first teacher. I got to spend some time with her before she died. She was quite a force. Here's what she said about this story. She said, now, while the verse of the sixth ancestor is the true understanding, that second one, the paradox for us is that we have to practice with the verse that was not accepted. We do have to polish the mirror. We do have to be aware of our thoughts and our actions. We do have to be aware of our false reactions to life. And only by doing so can we see that from the very beginning, what she calls the bottleneck of fear is an illusion. And it's obvious that we don't have to struggle to rid ourselves of an illusion, but we can't and won't know that unless we relentlessly polish the mirror. So she's saying, yes, the Six Ancestors poem was the greater understanding. But those of us here on the ground are going to have to practice. We're going to have to be aware of our thoughts and feelings and our actions. We're going to have to notice our habit patterns, our reactivity, the ways that it causes suffering. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to see through, beyond knowing, we're going to see through that reactivity and all those things are constructs that we create to protect a construct called the self. But we won't understand that illusory construction unless we sit and study and practice, which is what we're going to spend some more time doing tomorrow. If we don't relentlessly polish the mirror. See, mostly we pit samsara and nirvana against each other. Samsara, which is like everyday life, everyday struggles, suffering, troubles that we have. Samsara is just the everyday cycle. And nirvana is the word that's often used as the resolution to samsara. We'll wake up and achieve nirvana as an antidote to samsara. But the highest teachings tell us that actually samsara is a conceptual construct that we make up, and so is its resolution, nirvana. Nirvana is nothing more than overcoming our self-imposed fear of samsara, and it's not a thing in itself. You can't have a nirvana. It's a construct, and so is samsara. And samsara here, I'm borrowing from a teacher, Musong, a friend of mine, that we have this self-imposed fear of everydayness, of ordinariness, of everyday life, of what's right in front of us, ordinary mind. And we think nirvana is going to free us from that. But if you go to the larger understanding, you realize that samsara and nirvana are both processes, thereby making the attaining of nirvana an impossibility. That doesn't mean freedom is not real, but the way we think of it as a thing, seeking to overcome the fear of samsara, of everyday life, by finding a refuge in nirvana is a dualistic approach and cannot lead to the transcendent wisdom that we've been pointing to, which is essentially non-dualistic, and which says samsara and nirvana aren't distinct. This is it, folks. You can find freedom here. You can open your treasure chest here. And this may seem a little confusing. I like the teacher Stephen Batchelor's conceptualization, and once again, it's a concept that what we have are nirvanic moments. And what he calls nirvana is one moment in which we're free of reactivity. And so we have moments where we're free of reactivity. So we're free of the constructs, but we don't attain something. We're just simply free. The space opens up. We don't get something else. We don't say, oh, now I'm not in samsara, now I've got nirvana. Remember Confucian, it's not something else, somewhere else. It's right here. So why do we practice then? Because it's starting to sound like, wait a minute, what's the big deal about without practicing. So next story. I'm going to keep them coming here just for a little bit longer. Once again, from the 8th century. And in this case, a student was studying with a master and doing what his master had asked him to do. He was sitting in zazen. He was doing his practice. And the teacher came into the meditation hall and said, basically, what are you doing? Even though it was obvious what he was doing. What are you doing? What's your intention in sitting zazen? And the student said, I'm sitting zazen. And he said, well, why are you doing that? And he said, well, to attain awakening, to become a Buddha. This would be the ordinary way to think of it. And the old teacher said, oh, okay. And so he went over to the edge of the zendo, and you know, these old temples, things are always broken, and they're always under repair, and they have those beautiful tile roofs in China at that time. And so the teacher picks up a piece of a tile that had broken off, and there's a piece of a rock, and he starts rubbing this piece of tile right near where the student is trying to sit peacefully in meditation, in zazen. And so after a little while, being irritated, the student says, what are you doing? And the teacher says, well, I'm polishing this tile to make it into a mirror. And the student says, what? It's like, you can't make a mirror by polishing a tile. And the teacher says, yes, and you cannot become a Buddha by sitting in meditation either. And the student says, well, like, wait a minute, what do you mean? How could that be? And the teacher says, look, if you drive a cart, remember this is 8th century China. If you drive a cart, and if the cart stops moving, do you whip the ox or do you whip the cart? And he said that, the student was silent. He kind of fell into this not knowing, this beyond knowing. Again, maybe in a conventional way in which the story goes, you're thinking that the student was taking this in, but he's kind of taken it back and he's amazed by this response. So the teacher went on and said a little bit more. He said, when you practice sitting zazen, you're practicing sitting as a Buddha. When you practice sitting zazen, you'll know that Zen is not about sitting or lying down. In the practice of sitting as Buddha, the Buddha has no fixed form. And when you sit in zazen, when you sit Buddha, you go beyond Buddha, your idea Buddha. You transcend Buddha, what you think you know Buddha. If you are identified with the sitting form, you've not reached the heart of the matter. You've not reached intimacy, an even greater intimacy. You've not reached the nearness, the vast emptiness, nothing holy, the ordinary mind, which is the way. So once again, another story that's helping us understand this intimacy and this not knowing, but boy, is it an interesting territory. Peter Hershock, who's a wonderful teacher, I love his writings. He actually lives in Honolulu and works at the East-West Center there. He said, practicing Chan, he has a wonderful way with words. That practicing Chan is about successfully, gracefully, and even gratefully navigating uncharted and unpredictable seas. It's about how to navigate this life. How to find a way when we're looking for certainty when there is no certainty separated out from the ongoing, contingent, unrolling reality of life, it's how do we plunge in? And he uses the metaphor some of you have heard me use, the analogy, whatever, of like a jazz musician who practices. It's like polishing the tiles. It's like doing, suppose I'm playing the clarinet or something, or trumpet in a jazz ensemble. I'm playing the piano. I've got to play my scales and spend, like the monk that said it took him another 40 years to realize it. It would take me a long time to become so intimate with my instrument that I no longer had to think about when a friend in a group plays a few phrases and chords, I can begin to play and meet him, and it becomes a musical sort of magical thing, which is called jazz, rather than just noise. Something happens. And this is what we learn through practice, which is essentially, in Peter Hirschach's words, I love it, calls it improvisational virtuosity. That's how we gratefully and successfully and graciously navigate uncharted and unpredictable lives, seas, he said, through improvisational virtuosity. If we step outside of Zen for a second, we'll have a little breather. And I know we have about maybe 15 more minutes before we have a question and answer time. Here's Hafiz. We'll see what a Sufi says about this. It's a poem that has been titled in English, All the Hemispheres. Leave the familiar for a while. Leave the familiar for a while. Let your senses and bodies stretch out like a welcomed season onto the meadows and shores and hills. Open up the roof. Make a new watermark on your excitement and love, like a blooming night flower. Bestow your vital fragrance of happiness and giving upon our intimate assembly. Change rooms in your mind for a day. All the hemispheres in existence lie beside an equator in your heart. All the hemispheres in existence lie beside an equator in your heart. Greet yourself and your 1,000 other forms as you mount the hidden tide and travel back home. All the hemispheres in heaven are sitting around a fire chatting while stitching themselves together into the great circle inside of you. I thought it was such a beautiful expression of this. Leave the familiar for a while. Like a welcome season, open the roof, like a night blooming flower. There are times when the night blooming jasmine here blooms and we'll be sitting doing something ordinary like washing the dishes or watching TV, and suddenly you're hit by this amazing fragrance and it opens you, it turns you, you stop. Change rooms in your mind for a day. That's a practical one. Everything is right here. Intimacy, intimacy. All the hemispheres in existence lie beside an equator in your heart. Greet yourself. Sit Buddha. Greet yourself. Sit Buddha. Greet yourself, a sitting Buddha. And your 1,000 other forms, there are myriad parts in here, aren't there? As you mount the hidden tide and travel back home, everybody returns home. Everybody's sitting around chatting, stitching themselves together in the great circle. So what does this take? Well, I think it takes accepting ourselves just like we are. That's the return home. I'll tell a story that one of my students was using in her teaching. It was our head student in one of the English sanghas recently. She was talking about Nyugai Nyodai, who was a 13th century Japanese Buddhist nun. I wanted to kind of end on a woman here because we have so many men in these stories. And she is credited with becoming the first Zen abbess, Buddhist abbess. And she was variously described in some of the tales as being poor, or the daughter of a warrior, or married, or a servant, or all these different things. But in the story, she always finds her way into a monastery. where she's either a poor servant like Hui Ning or a nun. And what's common among the stories, though, is that her long studies and her long service with the monastery don't seem, in her view, to advance her practice. She doesn't seem to get anywhere. She still has the idea, remember? Somewhere else. She feels that enlightenment is beyond her grasp and is very despondent. She has the construct of nirvana somewhere else. And then she has this conversation with a kindly old nun who encourages her in her practice. We all need these mentors, don't we? And once again, here's the setup, as usual. The student comes to the teacher, and the elderly nun says, when Nyodai talks about her despair and her seeming failure, she says, "Oh, this is wonderful, my dear. This is so wonderful. In fact, what is there to attain? In Buddhism, there's no distinction between a man, a woman, between a lay person, a renunciant. Also, there's no separation between noble and humble, between old and young. There's only this. Only this. Each person must hold fast to his or her aspiration and proceed along the way of the Bodhisattva. There's no higher way than this." She's saying intimate, near, beyond knowing and achieving. And that night, as she walks along under the full moon, she goes to the well so she can get some water. And she sees the moon reflected in the water. And it's beautiful. And she's taking the water back up to the kitchen, and she sees the reflection of the moon. And it's so gorgeous. And just then, this old rickety bucket gives way and the water spills on the ground. And the reflection of the moon is gone. And she looks up and sees the actual moon. And in that moment, she realizes that all her ideas about herself, all of her constructs, were nothing but false reflections like the moon, being held together like a bucket that's patched together. And she released her delusions and was awakened. Her treasure chest opened. It's such a beautiful story. Ordinary thing was the way. And she wrote a little enlightenment poem, like these stories often have. Here's one version. She wrote, "In this way and that, I tried to save the old pail, since the bamboo strip was weakening and about to break, until at last the bottom fell out. No more water in the pail, no more moon in the water." Another translation says, "With this and that, I tried to keep the bucket together, and then the bottom fell out. Where water does not collect, the moon does not dwell." So often it feels like these stories help us with the bottom dropping out a little bit. And so we can go beyond everything we're holding, everything we're carrying, everything we're trying to grasp, everything we're trying to reach, and turn towards what's real, what's most intimate, which is nearest. It doesn't have anything to do with what we know. It's immediate. And I'll kind of wrap it up with the poem that Trudy Johnston, my student, wrote in response to this story. So we've come all the way from northern India, the early centuries of Buddhism, all the way to modern England, as they say, in the north, near the Lake District, entitled Moon in the Bucket. The staves have broken. The prescient, ancient water bucket is broken. The one I mended again and again because I couldn't let it go. All the work and time, the effort, the hope, the prayer, the desperation, and trying so hard. have failed. I tried to hold it all together. Glue, duct tape, spit, elbow grease, love, hate, prayer, despair. They all failed. I believed I had to hold forever, hold together for pride, for ego, for necessity, for life and death. Otherwise, everything would fall apart. It failed. It fell apart. The staves split. The water spilt. I could hold the moon no more. And in the failure came wholeness, the pure relief of failure. The moon now in the sky. And when she sent me the poem, her teacher, she wrote an extra little line, "Thank you for supporting me to fail." So these are our family stories. Going all the way back to the Buddha, from the Pali Canon, he says, do not believe in anything simply because you heard it. Do not believe in anything simply because it is spoken and rumored by many. Do not believe in anything simply because it is found written in your religious books. Do not believe in anything merely on the authority of your teachers and elders. Do not believe in traditions because they've been handed down by many generations. But after observation and analysis, when you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it. Find your own way. Dogen used the word menmitsu no kafu, the careful consideration of everything, intimacy, menmitsu, intimacy of everything. And it's literally translated as the family style. That's our way of practice. And that's what we'll be doing tomorrow. So, that's quite a run through many, many stories. But one, I hope, begin to knit together this way of approaching not knowing as going beyond knowing, as intimacy being close, as close as your own skin, of the way being ordinary and precious and right in front of you. Just like all of you are precious, and now it's time for you to be right in front of me. And if you have some questions or anything you'd like to discuss, you can just raise your hand, and Jessica will help you, and we'll see if we can have some discussion. Hopefully you've hung in there with me. I've talked a long time. You haven't gone to sleep or something. One of the things that, in the old koans that happens is the students have to show up so the teacher can do their thing. If you don't come forward, then I don't get to offer that stuff. But if you don't, then we'll just sit as a Buddha. It'll be just fine. And no question is too small, or what people call it, too basic or too simple. I like scrolling back and forth among all the pages to see all the faces. And it's like, oh, look, there's people in Minneapolis, and there's people in Denver. Oh my God, there's Marla. There's children, there's all these people that I've seen in so many different places. So I'm having a good time. But your response can be taken as, I don't know. Surely you don't want me to just talk more. Oh, you do? Diane's going. Mhm.
Okay, it looks like Judith has raised her hand. Judith, you can
Right.
unmute.
And you don't have to have a question, by the way. You can have a comment. Just let's talk, you know.
Well, good, because I don't have a question, but the talk tonight brings to mind something that I recently said to Cheryl. It would be so easy if I could just accept the Lord as my Savior and know that I was going to go home to be with him, you know, and it's like that just didn't work for me. So here I am stuck with this that on some level makes sense, but I don't quite get it. So I have to keep sitting.
So let's assume for a minute.
Okay.
We go with our teaching about not knowing or beyond knowing.
Right.
And so you say you don't get it. So that seems like that's actually the invitation. There's nothing to get.
Yeah.
But there is something to do. And that is continue the practice of coming home and sitting like a Buddha, so that when you go out in the world, you are a liberating function for others. We're not sitting for ourselves.
No.
And we're not sitting actually to change and get somewhere else, which is part of the teaching. We're sitting to realize what's possible as Judith in Little Rock, and what's each person wherever you are, so that you can be of benefit to others. There isn't anything to get, there's something to give. And it's a little bit different kind of situation. Although, having been raised in that same theology that you just mentioned, if I go back and attempt to strip away a lot of the things that were attached to the churches that I went as a kid, and looked at some of the more just simplistic parts, not simplistic as in simplistic, you know, but clear, intimate parts of the teaching, we see an image of someone who gave his life to go beyond what was being offered at the time, to step beyond, and to, oh, one can be liberated. And you see, you know, you hear the stories, which are couched in ideas of faith, but they're basically saying it's right here. You're already whole, you're already healed. Even if you don't see, or you don't, whatever those things are, you know, they're supposed to apply. It's already here.
Yeah.
And
so I am.
you know this is true, Judith, because if you forget what you think and watch what you do, what you do is over and over and over and over, you keep coming back. And you keep sitting, and you keep finding a teacher, and you keep inviting them. And in doing so, you're embodying the very teachings. Now, there's a lot of things that go in your mind that confuse you about it, but that's just let that be the confusion, you know.
Speaking of teachers, I am convinced that you came to Little Rock for me.
Oh, I did, because you kept pestering me to come, you know. That was lovely.
Little did I know what I was getting into, though.
Yeah, watch what you wish for, huh?
Yes. Well, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. I'm sorry, the sun has come out really brightly behind me, so things are a little dark, you know, on my face, but hope that's okay.
It looks like Jazz has raised their hand, so you can
Yeah, I
unmute.
thought of her a while ago when I was talking about jazz and improvisational virtuosity. There you go. She unmuted herself. It's good to see you. It's been a while.
It's really good to have Zoom so that I can be with Flint.
Yeah, we're together now, even though we're far apart.
Yeah. The word uncertainty, I do a mandala every year and I put a tag on it because it sort of embraces, here's what I'm preparing myself to go through in the coming year in terms of growing. Mm-hmm. For 2020, without knowing anything about COVID coming, I tagged my year uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And when I started doing the one for 2021, I could not get myself to tag it otherwise. So this is still uncertainty. And here I am in Austin without any water, all this stuff that's on. And my question, if it's a question, maybe it's just a comment. All of these things that are making us change our daily habits. Mm-hmm. Is this our bucket falling apart? And is this something we should be saying, fantastic, thank you, to?
Is it? I'm not trying to be opaque or silly, but you're asking a really good question in your comment. But you're actually offering the teaching back. You're saying that these things falling apart are offering us a possibility that wouldn't happen if everything's going along swimmingly.
They're making me drop my assumptions about what was reasonable.
That's true. And as we go forward in our lives, and especially as we get older, we begin to lose things like health, the ability to sleep through the night because you got to pee, and all these things that are very, I know it's very earthy, but things begin to change. And because you're beginning to drop your body. Mm-hmm. And drop capacities until the whole thing is dropped. There's only one direction. The bucket's going to fall apart. How free do you want to be in the time you have left? It doesn't mean you have to do something drastic or hurt yourself or destroy anything. That's not the point, of course.
No.
It's available right here. If you don't hide in delusion, including the delusion about spiritual practice.
I think surviving is a spiritual practice.
The spirit of survival.
In terms of physical things, but it is a spiritual. Without spirit, we wouldn't be here.
Does it take you beyond your ordinary ways of conceiving and manipulating the world? Yeah. Does it take you into mystery? Does it take you into grace? Then you're stepping across the line. You're going beyond.
Thank you.
Fritzy?
Hi, thank you so much. Could you say a little more about intimacy?
Sure. Are you in Little Rock?
Conway, Arkansas.
Oh, Conway, okay. You're close by.
Yes.
Yeah. The intimacy that I'm speaking about isn't the kind of intimacy that's just about a human relationship.
Right.
It's about meeting life and experience just as it is. Leaning in is an intimacy. Manipulating is an intimacy. Standing back is an intimacy. It's touching life to discover with curiosity and unknowing what it actually is, including being intimate with the parts of ourselves that lean in and that pull away and that manipulate. Mm-hmm. Being intimate with all of those too. Our basic sky-like nature of mind, our basic consciousness, which isn't really ours in a way, that isn't part of your personality, that's not an object of anything, that's just is always with you. And to meet the world with that, because it has no preferences, it doesn't try to move or do anything, it just meets. Now, there are times when we do need to change things. We do need to act. That's useful. But if you don't have some clarity of heart and mind, then we're usually acting out of our conditioned nature, and we kind of muck things up. At least we're likely to. It's like the famous kind of silly sounding but important line that one of my teachers, Norman Fisher, says. He says, the reason we sit on these cushions is just to stop making things worse. Because that's kind of what we do most of the time if we're acting out of just our habitual habits. But if we don't, sometimes we don't notice. So then we can now take that as something to be intimate with. Intimacy, even greater intimacy. Not knowing is near us. It's close by. It's close at hand. It's not some esoteric idea out there. And sometimes it looks like something human. Sometimes it's, do you have any grandkids or anything?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I have my first one on the way in May.
Oh, how exciting. See, what you just did, suddenly you had this excitement and you touch yourself, it's like you're excited about that closeness, right? So there is that kind of intimacy. Right now, what you're intimate with is excitement, the anticipation. You might even be intimate with fears or concerns. But just be intimate with each thing and let it unfold and move with this stream of life rather than trying to manipulate life to go your way, which is always going to be a broken bucket. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Marla?
I have a recurrent conversation with a friend who just happens to be Christian. It doesn't really matter that she's Christian. She could be Muslim or whatever. But the conversation goes like this. Tell me about that Buddhism stuff again. And the vexation that I experience in trying to simplify enough to just get her to leave me alone.
She's kind of curious about this.
Yeah, she's curious, but she's trying to make me wrong.
Well, is she fairly dedicated to her religious?
Over the top.
Oh, okay. That's fine. And
but
her
a very, very wonderful person.
Sure. But her way happens to be Christian. I just want to.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now that's useful.
And so I had a little epiphany that no longer must I try. No longer must I say anything except, I don't know.
Well, I'll give you a clever comeback and you see what happens.
Okay.
You can say to her, I can tell that your faith is extremely important to you. And I would imagine you have some concern about mine. And so this is what Buddhism actually is. Instead of believing in Jesus, what I'm trying to do is put on the mind of Christ. I might not believe, that's really not the key. I'm attempting to deepen into the practices so that I can see in that way and be in that way and model myself and become, like it says in Philippians, to put on the mind of Christ, as it was in you. There's actually scripture that supports it. And so it's that rather than believing in something, so that I can follow what Jesus was pointing to, which is the path of love. And so I'm engaged in these Eastern spiritual technologies that help me become like that, not just worship that. To see what happens. Sheila?
Hi, thanks.
Hi there.
This is a very sort of technical question. I think, but I just would like a copy of the poem that you recited that your student wrote for
Oh,
you.
there at the end? Yeah.
Yes.
Isn't it beautiful?
It's beautiful. And
Oh my
the
God.
idea of failure, breaking one open and waking one up is beautiful.
Yeah. And she took that story and became intimate with that nun. That's what she did. And what's interesting is there's an echo, because Siddhartha Gautama, who we now will call the Buddha after his awakening, was an ardent disciple of his teacher's practices. And it's said that he was like a spiritual genius. I mean, he did all of them and he did them really great. And, but he left the palace as a prince and went into this whole deal because he wanted to understand suffering and the releases. He wouldn't know what the deal was. And he did everything that his teachers told him to, and he meditated and had all these special powers and all that. And it was a complete failure because he didn't answer his question. He got all the benefits that meditation and all these things did, but it didn't answer his question. He was a failure. And so he decided to sit down under a tree, and all he had left was his own life, and his own body and his own breath in that moment. And he sat down, going beyond the seeking, going beyond. And so the whole wheel of the Dharma started to turn on his failure. When he gave up on all the stuff that he thought would make him into what he had hoped for. So there's something quite potent about this,
That resonates with me so much. I have a Christian background, and I saw myself, Buddhism sort of opened up for me because of what I perceived at the time as a failure as a Christian. Like I failed in my faith to hold that faith. And this gives me a whole sort of wonderful view of that it instead of this being some failure of mine, that it really is the waking up to a way that really is more true or more
it's somehow more full for you, and the kind of truth that the Buddha talked about in that last quote, not based on theology, philosophy, nothing. It's from your experience.
Right. Thank you.
It's interesting because my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was a Baptist minister, Southern Baptist. That's how I grew up. So my father was a preacher's kid, and so that's how I grew up, until my parents thought, wait a minute, this is not, something's not quite right about it. And they kind of left the church, and we did some other things. And then later on came back in a different way. But a few years before his death, my father, I don't know if you're familiar with this, did a renewal program called Walk to Emmaus. Some of you may know about this program. It's just a spiritual renewal program anyway. And in it, he found himself late in that retreat, sitting in a small chapel in the hill country in Texas, next to a window in an old country church, looking out, and there was a beautiful tree and a branch had broken. And when he looked at the broken branch, that's when he had his moment of realizing it was the brokenness that brought him back to what was most essential for him. And so my mother, I couldn't go there this year because my father died in May. My mother and sister and my dad's best friend surreptitiously scattered ashes under that tree because my dad asked for it. Not all of them, but a good, he said, that's where I had my turn, so I want some of my ashes there. So they went to the retreat center. Nobody was there because it wasn't happening, snuck onto the place. spread the ashes, and to honor brokenness as wholeness.
I'd still like to know where to get a copy of the poem.
I'll make sure it gets sent to our fearless leaders, and you'll be able to get a copy of it.
Thank you.
I may also, if you want, send you my essay that I wrote called Just As I Am. You know where that comes from. Yeah. Which tells a bit of the story. It's not long, but it's, I'll send that along too.
I was baptized in the Southern Baptist Church, so I know that intimately.
You know, we ended up there, April. I like the way the hands pop up in the corner here, and I see the person right away.
So I think this is just more of a fun observation, because
Okay.
one thing I do enjoy is just finding amazement in the ordinary.
Yes. Yes.
The light behind you with the sunshine,
Mm-hmm.
it's twinkling and dancing, and sometimes it syncs up with you talking where it was. So that was like, oh.
Wonder.
Mm-hmm. That was it.
That's perfect. Thank you. Absolutely. Kelly?
Thanks, Flint. I've really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. And there was a comment you made about idle concerns don't cloud the mind. If we don't let idle concerns cloud the mind, that we can become enlightened.
It's this person's happiest season.
Yeah, happiest season. That's right.
You know what? That line is actually translated. It's a man's happiest season. I changed it, but a person's.
Thank you. That was good. But the thought that came to me, like idle thoughts to me sound sort of mundane. It's like, what about those, fiery thoughts, those thoughts that make me jump off the meditation cushion or propel me into action and get, my heart racing, and it's just been, I feel like I'm at this place where my bucket is about to break. And it's frightening. It's terrifying. Like how, I feel like that, based on other experiences, that it will be okay, and that this is a growth period, and I'm willing to keep facing myself, and I see every day, there it is again, the ego making me, but at the same time, it's just like, it's still terrifying.
It is. And, one of the things that's easy to do if we follow the story along with the nun, is that we focus on her and the broken bucket and the transformation that comes from the brokenness, but we forget about her being held by the other nun. We forget about the holding. It's not that everything just goes to heck, She's being encouraged and held, and she goes back, and she can go back to that nun. And every one of those people in the other stories was held by their teacher and cared for. Without Sangha, without other people with us, it's just falling apart by itself isn't enough. That can lead to a breakdown, not a breakthrough. But if we are held in a wholesome way, then we have the space to not try to hold ourselves together in the same old way. And when someone else can hold us while that self-holding softens, then something new can move, if that makes sense. But if we don't have holding, sometimes we just feel terrified and we're going to fall apart. We try to hold ourselves, all the energy is bound up in the old habit of holding. So there's something different about being held, so that we begin to, let's say, loosen the bonds a little bit. Falling apart's a little strong.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Nora.
Hi, Flint.
Hey there. I didn't know you were there. So I get surprised by all my family that I love here. So
I'm just thinking about seeing the moon itself rather than the reflection. How that could also be misleading because it might seem that that would be sort of an endpoint in itself, that could lead to some some false clinging, perhaps. And I'm sort of thinking of it in the context of like my spiritual journey of trying to find sort of a religious home, and thinking, okay, I found it here. No, that wasn't quite it. Okay, I'm looking over here, and
well, it's important for you to remember, and you know this, it's not the moon, it's the looking. It's the seeing the moon, not the moon. It isn't just the pointing at the moon, the old image, you know, the finger pointing isn't it, but also the moon isn't it. But the willingness and the turning and the seeing, it's that activity, it's the actualization, not the object. If that makes sense. Yeah. It's good to talk to you.
You too.
Good. I hope we get another chance. And by the way, several of you have mentioned Christian backgrounds. There's a wonderful book by Paul Knitter, Knitter, who had been a theology professor at Union School of Theology, I think. And his book is entitled, Without Buddha, I Couldn't Be a Christian. And it's about some of the things he could not resolve in his faith, to which he returned, but only through Christian practice was he able to Buddhist practice was he able to come back and go, oh, okay, now I get what we're looking at here. So that's just a resource for some people that might be interested in it. Julie?
Yeah, so what I've been thinking a lot about lately is self-compassion. And this idea that I can give myself grace and that I am enough. And I also have been thinking about, well, if I am mindful and aware, and the more I get to know myself and do the right things, I could be amazing. I could have these great goals, or I could do great things. I could eat better. I could exercise more. I could be a better me. So how do I feel like I am enough and believe that fully, and yet motivate to achieve being better, being a better version of myself?
That's a classic question that comes with spiritual practice. Suzuki Roshi one time said to his students, you know, you're all perfect just like you are, and you could use a little improvement. You know, because we're talking from two different sides, the relative and the absolute. Are you perfect just like you are? Yes. You're amazing without any change. You are the wholeness expressing itself as this Julie now, and that's complete from an absolute point of view, without the conditioning that we put onto it. Are there ways in which you could take care of this creation better or express some gifts? Sure. And so we're called to that sometimes. And that can be joyful, but not because there's something missing or you're bad. It's because you feel called to it. As Suzuki Roshi called it, our inmost request, what calls us from that deep place to come forward, not because we're lacking, because the world needs us and we are practicing for the benefit of all beings. So, thank you. That's a great question. And by the way, that he also said, these little one-liners from Suzuki Roshi, he said, you know, we live off balance against a background of perfect balance. We live always off balance, human, every day, against a background of perfect balance. It's always okay, just like it is. So this is the two sides that we're working with. And Diane? You're still muted. There you go. Trying to turn myself a little bit to get in front.
I got it.
Okay.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this talk very much. One line that I hadn't really heard before that struck me deeply, especially in this time of COVID and lockdowns and life, is the self-imposed fear of everyday life.
The self-imposed fear of samsara.
Yeah, and of just the everyday. The just washing the dishes or the vacuuming or the regularity.
And isn't that interesting?
And so I did want you to say a little more about that, and I kind of connected it to the intimacy, the not willing to open or being contracted.
I think that there are plenty of things to be afraid of. I guess there was something I was thinking of, and it just went out of my mind. You know how that goes?
Yes, I do.
Trying to think of what was it I was going to say about that. It was really good, but I can't think of it right now. We were talking about fear of samsara, fear of the everyday. I think that 9 times out of 10, I find that people come to practice, whether it's explicit or implicit, with an attitude that's something like, this can't be it, about their life. It's like, there's something wrong. It can't be this. This is it. And basically out of a sense of lack. There's something missing, and it's probably in me, or maybe I project it, it's out there. If I would just act right, I could be a good person, or alternatively, if they would just act right, my life would be better. Or if I just had the right thing, but it's always something's wrong and it's a lack. And actually what these teachings begin to show us over a while is that sense of lack begins to fade, and we begin to rest in the intimacy of the moment about what we have. That's some of the shock of COVID. It's like, we're very, very circumscribed in some ways. It's like, how can I make this enough? And there are surprising answers to that question we find ourselves in sometimes. There's a lot of terrible things happening. I'm not saying that that's not the case. But it's amazing how terrified people are of actually living. People say they're afraid to die. It's like, no, they're really afraid to live, to actually face their life and everyone else. And this is a kind of a courage that isn't special or superhuman. It's just a willingness. And when we come to retreat, we're enacting that. I'm willing to kind of give up my time and the way I want things to go to move in a certain way. And that offers us a new opportunity, which we'll be heading into tomorrow. I'm sure Cheryl's going to say something about that.
Hi there, Flint. If it's okay with you, Flint, if you feel like it's a good time, I would like to kind of bring us to a close for the evening.
It is the time.
Okay. So I want to thank you, first of all, very much for this beautiful teaching, and thank everybody for coming, because I know what it would be like if you were just all by yourself trying to, you need us to help you. Anyway, some people are continuing on with the retreat tomorrow, and we will reconvene at 10 o'clock local time here in the same Zoom room tomorrow. But some people are not coming to the retreat tomorrow, not coming back. So I just want to say briefly a couple of things to those people, that Sangha is available with whether you're in one or not. And I want to make sure to put into this recording, because we're recording this. We will post it on the EBS YouTube channel. Maybe Flint will post it on some of his places. I don't know, but I want to say 2 things. One is that here at EBS, we have 2 Zen practice groups. One is Kwanum Korean Zen, and one is our Thich Nhat Hanh followers, but basically everyone's welcome to both of those. ebslr.org/online. And miraculously, during this pandemic, we have been inundated with people new people, brand new people, and it's wonderful. It's just huge, wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to encourage everyone to keep doing that, and don't fall apart alone. Fall apart with the rest of us. So
fall into our arms.
Fall into our arms. That's right. So we're here, and you're very welcome. And then I also want to say to the EBS people for whom may be seeing Flint for the first time, or the Arkansans, there are lots of ways to follow Flint as he is, especially now that he's traveling electronically rather than in person. So Flint, what would be a URL to go to find out what you're doing?
Well, there are two ways. You can go to flintsparks.org.
Okay.
Or Appamada, APPAMAD, appamada.org.
Okay.
And both of those will have information about the various places I'm teaching, things I'm doing. And they will point you to other places like the Open Mind Zen community, and then Awakening Together in Minneapolis. There are new places springing up, the Just This in the UK. But they're all linked together. This is like Indra's net in the
yes.
in the cloud Zendo in the sky, But I truly appreciate people showing up and being present, because it's one of the ways that I'm held and supported, and it means a lot to me. And it encourages me with the enthusiasm that I hope you feel from me to offer these teachings, because it's really important. And I think there are a lot of people that help. Jessica helps all the time with these things, and Kim Mosley, who's here too, is just remarkable help with my website and other things, and maybe some I haven't noticed.
Yes, thank you. So I have everybody's email that's here, and I will email you a notification when the video is posted and where and how to get to it, and also maybe anything else that comes up as we go forward with this. And so just thank you very much again, Flint, and thank you all of you. And do we dedicate the merit or anything here, or
how do you do it usually? The way that I'll do the short Zen one.
Okay, please. That would be great.
I'm going to first offer a blessing by John O'Donohue, and then the dedication to merit. So here's the small blessing to come home to yourself. May all that is unforgiven in you be released. May your fears yield their deepest tranquilities. May all that is unlived in you blossom into a future graced with love. And then the dedication. May our intention equally permeate every being and place with the true merit of Buddha's way. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, thank you.